Our next session will be on trust and legal frameworks for digital identity and verifiable credentials. A panel discussion moderated by Srijoni Sen, a legal advisor for IIIT-Bangalore. I'm going to invite her to introduce our panelists for the afternoon.
Can I have Vikas from GLEIF and Antony from the Center for DPI on stage, please? Thanks again for joining us. I'm going to actually ask you to introduce yourselves and your organizations a little bit. And if each of you could also then share your thoughts on what is a trust framework and why should this audience care about it?
Thank you so much. Antony, Muriithi, as you rightly put, Principal Technical Architect at Center for Digital Public Infrastructure. And in our day-to-day, like our main focus is offering tech advisory to countries in the best way to set up their digital public infrastructure, making sure that you have as much inclusion as possible. And with inclusion then comes as many social benefits as can be. And I think when it comes to trust infrastructure, we have to go back to the very basics of what is trust. And the aspect of me having confidence in the information that you share, be it the data that you share about yourself, forms the very basis of what trust infrastructure should be. So a means by which the attributes that an individual shares can be attested to be tamper-resistant or tamper-proof, and definitely excited to share a bit more detail on how verifiable credentials do that.
Thanks, Vikas. And if you could also add a little bit on the different kinds of actors that Antony mentioned. Do they think about trust differently?
Okay. So thank you, Srijoni, first of all, for putting me into the panel. And thank you very much to the entire MOSIP team for including GLEIF into the agenda. This is my first time I'm joining the MOSIP Connect, and I really like the atmosphere here and the way all the topics have been curated, all the workshops have been done. My name is Vikas. I'm from the Global LEI Foundation, and just for the people who have no idea about what is GLEIF. So it is a non-for-profit organization created by G20 and also established by Financial Stability Board. Financial Stability Board is one of the international bodies which provides recommendation to the financial institutions across the globe on the financial stability. There has been a lot of interactions around digital ID, but most of these interactions are around the citizen ID. We are the one which has been brought out to do something around the legal entity identifier, because that is also equally important, at least from a financial ecosystem standpoint, considering the level of systematic risk which it involves. So I'm here representing GLEIF, and very relevant question. I think trust and legal framework are both very important from a cross-border or I'll say interoperability standpoint. Technology is something which probably is, I personally don't feel at the current era is a challenge. Things are doable. There are a lot of, there's no dearth of tech expertise and there's no dearth of, the innovation which is going around. But one thing which is a challenge for every one of us is putting the right framework into play and bringing the ecosystem players into the common agenda and the common goal. So that is the most important piece probably which we all have to look at a country level, not only at the jurisdiction level, but also at a cross-border level. Yeah.
I hope to dig into a lot of what you said through the course of this panel. But Antony, if I can come back to you, a lot of the discussions around trust when you are talking about different issues, the issues seem to vary by whether you're talking about trust frameworks in a domestic context or internationally about cross-border context, right? So that's how we'll organize our panel also a little bit. So I'd like Antony to comment a little bit in a domestic setting, especially for countries that might be getting started on thinking about this journey, or there are legacy infrastructures, but now there are new demands for trust and legal frameworks. Both on the technical and the legal side, what do you think are some of the key elements, and how would you advise a country getting started when it's thinking about trust frameworks in the domestic context?
I think the first thing is to be 100% clear on the use case you're going to have to pilot everything. And I say that because the use case or the major pain point you'll be solving for is what will determine who issues a certain credential, how that particular credential will be signed, if it's going to reuse anything that you have in country or not, how it's going to be held. So are you going to prioritize holding it online or offline? And that also translates to what verification mechanisms you're going to have in place. So once the use case then is defined, it becomes incredibly easy to then identify what standards will best solve for that particular piece. And so in most settings, unless like you're talking about like cross-border travel, in most settings, it will most definitely start at a domestic level. It may begin with something as simple as students in higher learning institutions such as this want to have their degrees issued in a manner that they can share elsewhere and it is easily verifiable. And that would most definitely then mean what standard best handles a format for educational credentials and how then can that be shared? Does it ought to be like a simple QR code addition onto the existing university certificate templates? Does that need to be openly verified by any single employer, or do you want to have a closed verification portal that is only accessible through a trusted list of verifiers, and so on? So focusing on the use case and letting that trickle down to what standards can best solve for it is the place to start.
That's, I think, a very useful example for us to think about. And you started off with the series of choices that then must be made, right? With those choices also, can you comment a little on the infrastructure side of it, both legal frameworks, what do you think is a role of the law or about any kind of centralization, as well as technical infrastructure that might need to come in place, just for that use case that you mentioned?
The first thing is to definitely establish, do we have any data policies that exist in country that govern how the data may be shared across entities, or what controls or regulations ought to be there governing the holding of the data or the sharing of the data. The second key piece is very many countries have made tremendous investment in having public key infrastructure, and most definitely wanting to have as much reuse of that as possible beyond signing for passports and national ID. And so that becomes a second thing to figure out. Maybe you do need, like, beyond your root certificate authority, other issuing authorities that would primarily sit in serving the given sector that you want to serve, be it an education-driven one or a business registration-driven one. And then beyond that, the greatest thing that you want to focus on that is sort of like sits separate from trust and legal that people forget is the narrative that you're going to have around the usage, so that most of the focus can be on the value that's going to be given by the usage of this credential and the trust infrastructure, as opposed to just top-down mandate.
Examples you can share just on that last piece about demonstrating value, when it works, why it might fail?
Absolutely. I think the education one is super important. One is, I want to have a way, as a student who graduated in a university in Kenya, I want to be able to have a way to showcase to my employers that I have indeed matched the qualifications that I do have. They already accept a digital copy of my credential, and so there is, not of my credential, but rather of my certificate, as long as it is notarized. So the fact that they already accept that if there is some form of proof of validity, we will accept the digital standing of it. And so this simply becomes like an additional step. So as opposed to relying on a notary to notarize that digital copy that they're already accepting, you're now introducing a tamper-resistant mechanism that does not really change the laws that are required in place, but still applies. And I think that is one thing that also like really makes sense when you're identifying a key use case as a country, is to make sure that you're trying to first take the path of least resistance. Because if you're going to spend quite a bit of time navigating the legal minefield, it's going to delay the kind of impact that you are to have. So starting by evaluating which requires the least policy changes and then proceeding with that.
That very practical guidance. Vikas, I imagine a lot of this looks very different when you don't have national authorities, already somebody who can give those mandates, can make these decisions. So in a cross-border interoperability context, how does the trust framework landscape look, and what are the ways in which one gets started in that context?
This is a very difficult question to answer because this is a question, this is something which every country is currently probably trying to figure out what is the right answer and the solution to it. But maybe I would like to give here an example of the system which GLEIF follows and the principles on which it has been laid out. So GLEIF look at the legal entity identifier, which is ISO number 17442, which uniquely identifies a non-individual across the globe. Now, if you want someone to implement a standard identifier across the globe, it's not easy. If you say just by one international body says that all, it doesn't mean that jurisdiction gonna implement it. So what FSB and G20 has done, they have created a 3-tier structure for a effective implementation at a jurisdiction level. So they have created a committee called Regulatory Oversight Committee above the GLEIF, which is the top tier, which comprise of 70 plus financial market regulators. Reserve Bank of India is part of India from representing India. Similarly, ESMA from Europe, Federal Reserve from US, PBOC from China, various regulators are part of the body. Then comes the GLEIF, which kind of regulates the third tier, which are the issuers, the market infrastructure, which is actually issuing the LEIs. So when we talk about cross-border, interoperability effectiveness, it's not only about tech. It's about bringing the right ecosystem into the play. And when I say ecosystem, it is about the public-private partnership, not only at a jurisdiction level, but also at an international level. So it is a classic example to implement something at that scale. Because the only thing which probably brings friction is the non-recognition of other regional standards. So what LEI, so LEI is something which is not an Indian standard. It is an international standard endorsed by G20. But you will be surprised and amazed to know that you have only heard about Aadhaar as a story from an India stack standpoint. But LEI is something which is which has been very strongly endorsed by our financial central bank, which is the Reserve Bank of India. And India has recently, this month, became the largest LEI issuer across the globe, surpassing US and Europe. So this is one of the examples which probably we give it to all the jurisdictions, because Reserve Bank of India has recognized LEI under one of the acts, which is the Payment and Settlement Systems Act. So sometimes it is not important to mandate, but a simple recognition is important under the legal framework, so that a proper trust can be built when somebody is going to implement or get into that issuance of that framework. I hope I answered your question.
No, absolutely. And that one example is very useful to think about. We also do see a proliferation of different kinds of trust models for different contexts and different use cases. Do you think we'll continue to see that kind of proliferation, or will there be convergence around some ideas in some regions and some use cases?
So I think very right question. I think there are different trust models. There are different technologies which are coming into play. I think this will evolve with time. You can't stop that, and it is equally essential to evolve with time, because we need to mitigate risk. We need to upgrade ourselves with the time which we're going to see. But one thing which is important is the attributes of the data element should be standardized across the globe. So that's what, even if you refer to one of the recent G20 reports, which talks about frictionless cross-border trade, and they have laid out few guiding principles for the jurisdictions to adopt in order to have proper, frictionless cross-border trade. One of the building blocks was to implement an identifier which is standardized, very similar to LEI. So this has already been recommended by G20 to all the countries. So it does not solve everything. I'll not say it is one thing which is probably solving the complete puzzle, but having the correct data element and the attribute actually helps to unlock a lot of value when it comes to dissemination and transparency across border.
Yeah, I think the trade aspect and the idea of unlocking value is something that is moving a lot of decision makers in this space. There's also, of course, the risk, like what happens when you don't have trust frameworks, right? And, for me personally, I always found it a bit difficult to really, I'm a lawyer by training, I found it a little difficult to relate to these discussions till somebody gave me an example of something that's been happening in my country, India. Instant payments through QR codes have become very, very popular. It's the only way any of us pay anymore. True in very other parts of the world as well. And one of the entities that have adopted QR code-based payments are temple donations. So you'll find small temples which put up QR codes so that people can digitally donate money. What people then maybe in smaller temples seem to have done is taken away the temple's QR code and replaced it with their own personal QR numbers so that you don't realize, but you're actually paying some individual rather than the temple in which you're trying to donate. There might be some karmic implications to this, but this brought the question of trust really alive in my mind, is saying, when you have people, you are interacting with someone on this network, you're using an instant payment network, the UPI in our case, you are trusting that the QR code you see in front of you in that temple belongs to that temple, but there's no way to actually know. And those are the kinds of risks that you have without trust frameworks in place, I imagine. So what do you think in 5 years from now, if we don't see enough progress with trust frameworks, whether digitally or legally, what are some of the consequences that you all see? And if both of you could comment.
I think one of the first key things that relates heavily to what you mentioned is you need to have, in some contexts, verifiable, trusted issuers. And we've seen a lot of convergence of thought on that in establishing trust lists for issuers so that those who are verifying certain credentials can know that these are the issuers who are authorized to issue them and you can trust them. And whilst that has sort of like been an adoption that has been taken from the historical public key infrastructure approach, where you also have certain people authorized to sign using certain certificates, we're seeing more and more push towards decentralization so that it can like really democratize access. And with great power like that also comes great responsibility. And because we are, by going the decentralized route, trying to give way more control and access to data to the citizens or to the users, it is imperative that we also have as much information shared to them. With what responsibility then comes in. It is your responsibility as the holder to make sure that you know who you're sharing your data with when it comes to verification, and the implication of just sharing it with everyone, what that means when you end up now exposing yourself. And I think that balance is not something that we can run away from. So instead, what we should focus on is sensitizing the population as much as possible that, yes, your data has been given back to you, but here are the measures that you also need to put in place to do it. But last but not least, from a regulatory standpoint, in terms of like putting those controls, beyond having like your trusted issuer lists and so on, we also need to make sure that those who go against that law or infringe on people's data privacy should also be met with like heavy repercussions so that it can also be like a learning that they need not go that route.
Yeah, I think there's no question around it. I think for me, I think trust is very, directly related to a governance framework attached to it. So a governance framework is something which is very important. So there has to be proper guidelines, proper governance framework, that who is the issuer, who could be the issuer, is there a proper mechanism to audit someone, is there a proper mechanism to probably revoke few things, Is there a proper root of trust? So it's very important to just not provide a recognition to the ecosystem, but it's also equally important to create a proper, pre-created kind of a ecosystem which defines everything, right? So that's equally important. And that's when we see all these kind of ecosystem or kind of a governance framework into play, trust automatically builds up. You take examples of capital market. There is a very high amount of risk which is associated to it. But look at the kind of governance framework stock exchanges or the capital market regulator actually implement. They have right kind of risk management infrastructure in the play. So governance framework is something which is important. If we have to look at longer horizon, I think that has to be considered. Yeah.
I know, I guess we were crystal clear, but I'm sure the panelists are around for offline chats if anybody wants to talk to them. And thank you both so much for spending this time with us.